First one that I read was The King of Elfland's Daughter by Lord Dunsany. This is an extremely influential book. This had a big influence on Lovecraft, had a big influence, most importantly, on Tolkien, and I have to imagine had a big influence on Moorcock as well. I tried to substantiate that somewhere. I think this is the well from which Elric is drawn. I can say, with basically no second or third thoughts or hesitation, that Dunsany is a better writer than Tolkien. This is one of the most beautiful books I've ever read, and I'm glad that I picked it first because it gave me that feeling that I feel like I am/was missing from Lord of the Rings. The plot is very basic. It's this rural English countryside set in medieval times where there's an enchanted kingdom called Elfland, if you couldn't have guessed, that abuts it. And a human prince ventures into it to win the love of the elf princess and steals her back into the kingdom of men where time works normally, and in Elfland, time is suspended. So nobody ages, nobody dies. He was preoccupied with aging and death, the passage of time. And the work has this solemnity to it. I'll describe it as poetic, both in the sense that you expect me to mean it, of simply that it is beautiful, and also poetic in its form. The prose has these recurring snippets, almost like music, these recurring phrases. 9 out of 10, I don't imagine I will read a high fantasy book anytime soon that will touch this one. Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula Le Guin, an oft recommended book. I think, to be quite frank, I missed the train on reading Earthsea at the right time in my life. I'm 35 years old. I liked it fine. It was a good book. Didn't particularly move me on any level. I thought it was a little bit cliche, which is not really a fair criticism to lay at its feet because it was written, I think, in 1968. Early in her career, this was her first hit, her first breakout success book. Yeah, 1968. So it set the mold. It's cliche in reference to itself in terms of fantasy, like young adult, juvenile fantasy. However, much time has elapsed, and as much as I love Le Guin, I just did not get swept up in it. It did feel like it was a different Le Guin, which it kind of was because she wrote this before she wrote her big science fiction classics. But it really felt like a different writer. The prose was very, very different. Big departure from Dispossessed and Left Hand. Obviously, it was a book written for teenagers, so it's not going to have quite the same level of sophistication. And there's nothing wrong with the prose, but it was more workmanlike. It was more succinct. That's one of the only criticisms that I have about Le Guin, is that people say that her books are boring because they are just slightly too long. And you kind of have to sit with her in lotus position and meditate with her and wait for the exciting parts of the Zen koans to kick in. Probably Left Hand of Darkness is worse on that front than Dispossessed. But she takes her time. This is slim. Also have not confirmed this, but I feel like this is Jungian allegory, which I don't think is a great thing. It just kind of makes my eyes roll because it's so very 1968. I gave this a 7 out of 10. I know that this is kind of dripping with ire, or it feels that way. It just simply is YA fantasy, which is not something that I particularly care for. I don't particularly care for adult fantasy even to begin with. This is kind of me trying to eat outside of my comfort zone, as it were. It wasn't quite for me. I am not motivated to read the other books, even though this was perfectly serviceable. Swords and Deviltry by Fritz Leiber. The first of the Fafhrd and Grey Mouser series, which is his most well-known work. It's a compilation of 3 stories. The first one was written in 1962, and the others were written in 1970. The first thing to be said about it is that it is sword and sorcery that was probably written with young male readers in mind, but it doesn't suffer the usual pitfalls that kind of a thing does. I do not consider this pulp reading or popcorn reading or pandering Narratively, they're nothing groundbreaking or amazing, but thematically, they're not without substance. There's a certain amount of sophistication that went into the writing of the stories, especially the first two, the Snow People, the Snow Women, and the Unholy Grail, which introduce in turn Fafford, the Scald, the barbarian bard, and the Grey Mouser, who is an apprentice wizard. Those two stories are impressively sophisticated for what they are. The last one, which is actually the most famous in this, and I think it's the most famous Fafford and Grey Mouser story, Ilmet and Lankmar, I was not nearly as impressed with or smitten by. It did certainly have twists and turns and a surprising ending, a surprisingly dark ending. But I do think that it just felt slightly too much like a D&D campaign for me. It just felt like box text from a first edition D&D story. Which, surprise, surprise, it was a highly influential sword and sorcery book. I don't know if this was cited in the Gary Gygax index of books that were influential on D&D. I wouldn't be shocked if it were. All of the stories are preoccupied thematically with gender relations and the gender war. In Snow Women, Fafford has to overcome an overbearing mother, kind of an overbearing, controlling matriarchy of older women in his village, and navigate his sexual relationships and also weigh his worldly ambitions and curiosities and wanderlusts against his sense of duty to his tribe. Snow Women was the highlight for me. I remember being also impressed by Unholy Grail. I remember much less about it. It's about the Grey Mouser as an apprentice wizard coming into a relationship with his own power and learning how to utilize it, and treading a kind of moral ambiguity at the heart of his exercise of magic, which is where he gets his nickname, the Grey Mouser. He's neither white nor black. He is a gray wizard, which is an interesting premise. And then the third book is kind of a swashbuckling adventure. The two of them meet up and become bosom buddies and go on a raid together. That's played a little bit more for comedy than the other two until it isn't. And again, is entertaining. Not a whole lot else, though. Overall, it was above average, exceeded my expectations that were admittedly kind of low. I didn't expect anything more than just kind of cheap entertainment. And it delivered that, and it also delivered a little bit of a payload of, wow, I feel like I'm reading a book for grown-ups. Gave this a 7 out of 10. Picked up Nine Princes in Amber, the first Amber book by Roger Zelazny. This is a first edition paperback in really good condition. I was lucky to find this. And I tore through this in a day. I just zipped right through it, started reading it around noon, and off and on I finished up at around 8 p.m. So that tells you something about the book. This is, I believe, the third Zelazny that I have read. The other two were The Dream Master and The Isle of the Dead. I put this between them. Dream Master, definitely still my favorite. And then Nine Princes in Amber, and then Isle of the Dead. This suffers from a couple of the flaws of Isle of the Dead that I will get to, but has a lot of virtues that book didn't necessarily have. It's a high fantasy story that begins in media res, in the middle of the action. We follow the protagonist who is waking up in a hospital bed, not remembering how he got there or who he is, and effecting an escape and fleeing on instinct to reconnect with a woman who claims to be his sister, and coming to realize that he's a person of great power and historical import. It transitions from being this mystery to being pure high fantasy at around the halfway point. In terms of a well-constructed narrative, a page-turner, I thought it was great. It was wonderfully entertaining, and it creates, in a relatively short number of pages, a really huge, expansive, and rich world. I have a couple of criticisms of the book. One is pretty easy to articulate, which is just that it lacks thematic depth. There's not a whole lot going on under the surface, at least that I noticed. It's mostly just an adventure story, kind of a page-turner fantasy thriller, which is perfectly fine. The other one is harder to put my finger on, and it probably just makes me sound like an asshole. Yes, I understand context. I understand that this book was written in 1972. It was a different world. The language is going to be different. But it has all of these holdover artifacts, linguistic artifacts of that time that Zelazny deliberately put in there to try to kind of contemporize it and casualize it. And it dates it so horrifically badly, and it's so irritating, and it just is knocks me completely out of the narrative every time that it happens, and it's like fingernails on a chalkboard. I can't stand it, and it's, again, hard to put into words, but you know it when you see it. It's just, all of a sudden there will be this spike of the characters throwing in some terminology from 1972, or an overly familiar or casual phraseology in how they talk, or really dated lingo. Like, I don't think he called anybody a cat, cat like cats, but that kind of thing. Spinrad does this too, or did this too, and it's not a mortal sin, but it still dates it in the bad way. There are certain hangover things that date a book that don't matter to me, and for whatever reason, this particular detail really does. It really diminishes my ability to enjoy the prose, because it just feels like a trick. It just feels like Zelazny trying to be cool and cute. It's almost like he is breaking the fourth. He's just putting a little hole through the fourth wall and peering out at you and kind of winking through the little keyhole in the fourth wall, which is even more annoying to me than if he just broke the fourth wall. Like, Ian M. Banks, just to piss more of you off, Ian M. Banks did this in Player of Games, and at the end of the book, it's kind of revealed that, oh, it was from the perspective of this one character. But for the first couple times that it happens, it's not made clear that it's from the POV of one of the characters in the book. So you think it's just Ian M. Banks breaking the fourth wall and talking to you on this meta level and commentating on the action of the story and joshing around with you about it. It drove me up the wall. That's less annoying to me than injecting this hepcat, cool guy, street lingo into the story unnecessarily, where it doesn't belong. I don't mean to lose my goddamn marbles about it, but it is a very salient detail that will stick in my memory. So maybe you're not a freak like me, and you can just read a book and be normal about it. But it did detract on some level. I gave this a 7 out of 10. I would be perfectly happy to read more Amber books, despite everything that I just said. I'm actually much more interested in reading further Amber books than I am Wizard of Earthsea, simply because the narrative itself was captivating, and it was great fun to read. We finish with Black Easter by James Blish, which this is a sequel to, and I reviewed this on the channel already, not knowing at the time that I found it and read it that it was a sequel to this, The Day After Judgment. That's got the Wayne Barlow cover that you can't see because of my spooky mood lighting. That also has a Wayne Barlow cover that's actually close to a wraparound. Wayne Barlow is my favorite genre artist ever, and makes it doubly special. This is total masterpiece. This, I think, is the best James Blish book that I've read. I haven't read this in a long time, this Upside Down book, Day After Judgment. I think this is the better book. I think this is a true masterpiece. I think it's actually better than Case of Conscience. It has all of its thematic sophistication and its feeling of just hundreds of hours of research having gone into it to get every little historical detail correct. And all of this like moral gravity, the seriousness, and the contemplation at the heart of the story. But it's more consistent. It's more streamlined. Case of Conscience is a fix-up of 2 novellas, big narrative departure after the second half, and of course the big payoff at the end, the very enigmatic, crazy ending, probably one of the best endings of any book that I've ever read. This is just so streamlined. It's so precise. It's such a, like, if it was a movie, it wouldn't be, I don't know what to compare it to, but it'd be one of those sleeper classics that would be studied in film school as like every shot being perfectly well composed and not a whole lot happens, but it's a psychological, slow build. It has all these thematic, metaphorical layers. It's like that. In a lot of ways, it feels like a horror movie from that era, from the 60s and 70s, which is funny because this was marketed specifically to a reading audience of people who had liked the movie Rosemary's Baby. So they published it and marketed it as a horror in the literary fiction or just general fiction section instead of marketing it to science fiction and fantasy readers, which meant that it was relegated to a place of almost complete obsolescence for many years until it was republished at some point, I think in the 80s. I could be wrong, but this was just memory hold almost immediately, and this was non-existent. This was a complete failure when it was published. This is probably his most serious book, though, or certainly the most serious of the books that I've read from him. He published a lot of books. I would really like to read all of them at some point. He's a special author. He's not like other authors. There's nobody that I can really compare him to. He's his own animal. It's strange. So erudite, so well read, so broadly read. I mean, he was famously a polymath. He was deeply literate in fiction and science. He was a critic as well. He published all kinds of literary criticism of science fiction when he was in a position of authority as an editor, and never quite broached celebrity as a writer, even though he was such an influential figure. He's actually best remembered now, for the Cities in Flight books and also for writing Star Trek novelizations, which is wild to think about. But he wrote those while he was writing books like this. It's about a man who's high up in the American military, contracting with a black magician to perform nefarious acts of black magic in a universe that I think is meant to be the near future, where magic, both white and black, is real, based on actual quote-unquote magical texts, arcana, and occult texts from the Catholic tradition that actually exist in the world. Nothing by Blish's accounting of his writing process was actually completely fabricated from scratch. It was derived from ceremonies and metaphysical beliefs that had precedent over many hundreds of years. So it has this sense of borderline believability. Nobody writes like Blish. It's so hard to put into words why he's so special. I'll just say the more I read from him, the deeper my respect for him grows. It's a hard one to pitch, I think, because he's so incredibly serious and so scholarly, I guess is the word for it. There's just a touch of humor in what he writes. There's just this little bit of satire in Black Easter and in this and in Case of Conscience that makes it go down a little bit smoother, but at heart, he could have written this as an academic treatise or a piece of just straight philosophy, and I think it would also have worked. To do it injustice by attempting to nutshell it or summarize it and its thematic concerns, it's worried about the pursuit of secular knowledge. That's, by his own description, what the uniting theme of all the After Such Knowledge books was. And he claims he didn't realize this until after he had written them, but he had been asking this question of, is it dangerous and evil to seek out knowledge for the sake of knowledge? I don't know what the philosophical terminology for this would be, but he's concerned with the structural limitations of good and evil. If evil is unconcerned with the rules and laws that are meant to bind it, and good by definition is adherence to a set of rules and laws, how can good ever hope to triumph over evil in the absence of an actual intercessory divine power for good? And that's not my opinion or insight. That's laundered from Joanna Russ in a quote that's in the afterword to this. But I can't put it better than her. Read it for its philosophical depth. Read it for the fact that it's simply a kick-ass story about demons wreaking havoc in the world. Read it for whatever reason, but just read it. It's a 9 out of 10. It would be a 10 out of 10 if it was just a little bit snappier with the narrative. It's not quite as tedious in parts as Case of Conscience is, but it is just a little bit slow, just slightly slow. Still managed to read it in what would have been one sitting had I not started it at like 1 a.m. last night. Am I a fantasy reader now? No, not really, but I'm more open to it now than I was. The next books will probably all be science fiction though. So I'll see you then.